civil and human rights issues and how they impact your daily life. My name is Charles Bryson, Director of the Civil Rights Enforcement Agency, under the auspices of Marilyn Cruzen and your host. Playing the game is always we do not only like to use it. This podcast can be seen on Facebook Live, recorded at mycitymusic.com. And today we will discuss issues of elections and voting in the city of St. Louis. With me here are Gary Stoff and Steve Keezy from the City Board of Election Commissioners. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So let's jump right in. We talk a little bit about the duties and responsibilities of the Board of Election Commissioners, and if people don't know that, I mean that. But we've got a number of elections scheduled this year in the city. What do we have going on?
We do. Our function is to conduct elections in the city of St. Louis. So in 2020, we started with a March presidential preference primary on March the 10th.
Which is what is a presidential? Is it because we don't caucuses?
Correct.
So we actually, people can go in and vote who they would prefer to see as, I guess, the Democrat and Republican presidential nominee. Is that what it is?
Correct. It's like primary. So there are Democrat candidates, Republican candidates, Libertarian, Green Party, and Constitution. So anyone who wants to vote on March the 5th, March the 10th, like any primary, they have to take a party ballot. That doesn't necessarily mean they're card carrying, whatever, but they have to take that ballot. And those candidates, there's a filing deadline for them at the end of December. They file with the Secretary of State's office. The Secretary of State's office sends out the official ballot, and that's the only thing that will appear on the ballot on March the 10th. And right behind that, on April the 7th, there's a special citywide, city and county-wide MSD bond issue in August. August the 4th is the other primary, if you will, when all the other candidates for governor on down to committee person will be running. And then on November the 3rd is the presidential general election.
So we have so in the city, in the region, but in the city we have I try to count 4 different elections coming up during the course of this year.
Correct. So far.
If so far, if I'm not registered to vote after one of them, do I have time to register to vote for the next one? So if I, for some reason, maybe I just moved to the city from some other state, and so I actually physically have to register. Can I register? So I missed a March deadline to register, that I know. But is there a time frame between that and the April election where I can come in and vote, come in and register to vote?
Yeah, typically registration's about a month before the election. So you actually haven't mentioned March yet. It's February 12th. Yeah. So you can still down and register to vote for the March election. But you could still register at any time. You just may not be eligible for that immediate election that's on us.
Because it's 30 days out.
Yeah, it's 30 days out. But you could still register and then be eligible for the next election. And that goes for anybody out of state or of our jurisdiction. So if you live in St. Louis County, you would need to still re-register with the City Board of Elections. And you can do that any number of ways. The easiest is to come down and see us at 300 North Tucker. But you could also go on to the Missouri Secretary website, and there's some links through there. There's some links through the Department of Revenue website now. You can go to the Department of Revenue in office. You can go to any local library here in the city and register. You can also do it online or through the mail through our website. We try to do as many ways as possible to get people to register to vote. But you do have to be aware of deadlines. So that, like we said, that the closest one to come up is February 12th if you'd like to vote in the March election.
You make a great point from the standpoint. You can register anytime, but to vote in a particular election, you have to be registered by the 4th Wednesday before that election. It's important because you raised the question just a moment ago. If somebody moves, one time in the metropolitan area, someone moves from the city, the county, or vice versa, and they were registered at their prior address, they don't think they need to register an address. They do. If they move within the jurisdiction, one address in the state to another is still registered, but they should update their voter registration address. So after election day, they go to a correct polling place and don't waste time standing in line to find out, oops, I need to go somewhere else.
And because part of those folks are precinct different. And so you need to know what ward you live in, but the precinct you live in to know which line to stand in.
You do, and when we send out the election notice card prior to each election, so if you're like this with more than one precinct, we try and be alert for that, but it's come on the voter to make sure they get in the right line and don't invest a lot of time standing in one line only to find out they need to go across the road.
Right. Steve, you raised the conversation. When you are voting, you primary. Do you need to declare for Democrat or Republican, Green Party? How is that handled?
So the only declaration that we have in the state of Missouri is when you go up to the polling place to the table, you need to tell the poll worker which ballot you select. But that's not recorded in any fashion in the state of Missouri. It's not marked on once you make ballot or mark your ballot, it's an anonymous ballot. You don't put your name on it. So the only person that knows the party affiliate that you polled would be yourself and the poll workers at the polling place. Other states have different rules on that. But in Missouri, we do not, the Secretary of State's office, nor do the local Board of Elections office keep track of party affiliation.
So I can come up and whisper in your ear. And that's okay.
That is okay.
Because only two people never mind. So only people know that are you and me. And that really depends on the ballot that's given, because not everybody is on every ballot.
That's correct.
Republicans are on a Republican ballot, Democrats on a Democrat ballot. Where do Green Party people go? Do they?
There's a Green Party
There's a
ballot,
Green
there's
Party
a Constitution Party, and a Libertarian Party ballot.
Okay, so everybody has their individual ballot. So you need to know that, because I may want to vote for other people who may not be on another ballot. Would that be fair?
You may want to, but you can't in a primary. Now, by the time you get to the general, there is a single ballot for every voter, because whoever wins the primary, they will automatically appear on the general ballot. So in November, you don't need to declare any kind of a party ballot. You just get whatever ballot is available that day, either paper or electronic. And the only exception of what you just described, you and Steve were chatting about, is in August in that primary, if there should be an issue on the ballot, a proposition of some kind, whether it's 1 or 3 or 4 or 5, there is a nonpartisan ballot available at that kind of a primary. There will not be one on March the 10th.
Correct.
There likely will be one on August the 4th. And so if someone feels very strongly, I do not want to take a party ballot, and if there are issues available, then they can take the nonpartisan ballot and still vote on those issues.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the things that you all mentioned, I know there was a Missouri Supreme Court ruling having to do with increasing the availability of voter registration, and I think that was through the State Department of Revenue was going to put. So I guess we're getting a little closer to motor voter in Missouri, but can you explain a little bit about what the ruling was and what effect it may have on people having access to voter registration?
Sure. I think the easiest way to explain it is it makes it more accessible. When you go online now to change your voter or to change your Department of Revenue address or change the plates on your car or anything like that online, there'll be a pop-up window called a portal that'll pop up to give you that option to notify your local board of elections to change your vote address as well. They've already done that when physically, if you would show up, that option should have been given at all times. Hey, you're changing your address, make sure, do you want to change your voter address as well? But now it makes it a little bit easier online that this window will pop up to direct you to the proper website to change that address as well. We think it's a good thing because it's going to keep our voter databases more accurate, and allow people to change their registrations earlier in the process. Because let's be honest, the last thing you're thinking of when you move is to change that voter address. So it's good to have that reminder that pops up on the screen to allow you to do that easier.
So that raises an interesting question of where's my home and where's my voter address. So if I've lived with my parents and I like the ward I lived in, I have to do this by ward for it to make sense, and I move, but I still want to vote for that particular older person. Is that frankly kind of illegal?
Yes, I mean you should be voting only
Go
where.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean you need to vote where you live. So if you're the easiest explanation is once you move and you start a new residence where you're spending the night, that's where you should be voting at whatever precinct that is in the city of St. Louis. So regardless, if you like a different ward or like a different aldermanic person, since you don't live there anymore, you shouldn't be able to vote on that election. You should be voting on the election of where you live.
Which brings to mind, I guess I'll use the term sweeps that go on where different states have removed people from the voting rolls. I would argue that part of that process really is I've moved from one location to another. I keep voting where I used to live because my mom lives there, my dad lives there, my cousin, whatever, instead of the new place. But I could see where in the voting roll, if you compare the address to which I vote versus the address to which I live, you could actually make the argument that, well, you're voting illegally because you live here, but you live in this area, but you're voting from this area. Therefore, we should legally remove you from the voting rolls. Is that?
Well, that gets into a question of residency, which is always a kind of a challenging legal issue. So, for example, our representatives in Congress, they live somewhere in Missouri. They live in St. Louis City, St. Louis County, whatever. But they spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. They may have a residence in Washington, Virginia, whatever. But if they consider Missouri their permanent address, then they're never going to change and register where they're working. So someone who moves but considers that move to be a temporary move, there's no immediate mandate that they change their voting address. And if there's some question, a student, for example, living with their parent, now they go away to college, and instead of voting an absentee ballot in St. Louis, they register where they're now living, even though they don't intend to live there beyond maybe 4 years, and they vote there, which, okay, the issue becomes a problem when someone has two locations, tries to register in two jurisdictions, and tries to vote in two jurisdictions. That's very difficult to do in Missouri, but potentially someone could be registered in Missouri, be working out of state, register somewhere else, and there's no easy way to track that. So potentially someone could, under those circumstances, vote twice and be violating the law.
But do all voters and voting lists end up with the Secretary of State's office where some of that might be uncovered? I'm thinking somebody who lived here, maybe to UMKC, never dropped their St. Louis registration, didn't think about it, registered for some election in the city of Kansas City. Wouldn't the state somehow be able to catch that?
The state's database, yes. But within the state of Missouri, I think what Gary's...
It wouldn't be on the it wouldn't be the Kansas City C would not have or show up a duplicate registration that would actually be on the state level.
Well, we all share the same database, and so when the Kansas City office would put that registration in, it would pop up, oh, well, Steve Capizzi is already registered in the city of St. Louis. So it would change my registration from the city of St. Louis to Kansas City. I think what Gary was getting to is out-state transactions. So although some states do have joined a database to cross-reference those kind of things, it's not all 50 states. But we're moving towards that to hopefully prevent those kind of issues going forward. But on the local level, on the state level, there is double checks to make sure you are only registered in one jurisdiction at a time.
And the situation you described, if I go from City of St. Louis, where I'm registered, to any other jurisdiction in Missouri, and I register there, there's a place on the form to indicate if I've previously been registered elsewhere in Missouri. If I complete that information, then the new jurisdiction will promptly notify the old jurisdiction. If I don't indicate that, if I just indicate I'm living here and I'm registered, the new jurisdiction won't necessarily know that I came from a previous jurisdiction, but when that goes through the Secretary of State's office, which is the centralized voter registration database, then that system will generate a duplicate registration report and notify the old jurisdiction. Gary's office knows it's over. Yeah.
All right. So I know, because this is your third time being here, I know that like in previous year, you have completely filled up the number of election judges. that
We were so
100%. So how are you? How many more election judges do you need? And I want to talk a little bit about how they are A, trained, and B, how you disperse them, because I've looked at a few elections previously, and what I see is two things. Number one, there's a rhythm to how people come and vote normally, and B, I can see where there would be a need to possibly move one person from one locale to another, because a shortage, or all of a sudden you get 4 o'clock at noon and everybody goes off work at the same time, and your polling place is slammed, and may need to take somebody from one place to another. So let's start getting how short are we on election judges, and how many do we need? And I'm sure we need both Republican and Democrat as always.
Well, we are always looking for additional judges. So if you think in terms of, we have 111 polling places, which we need at least one Republican and one Democrat judge, a poll manager. So now we're over 200. We have 222 voting precincts, for which we need at least one Republican and one Democrat election judge. That's additional 450 workers that we need. We always need some in reserve in case someone doesn't show up on election day or get sick. And for the larger polling places, which have the situation you described, a larger number of registered voters, then we like to place additional poll workers to handle that volume. So we're constantly looking for judges, because people generally are very loyal, but may want to work this election, not that election. And in the city of St. Louis, which is a very heavily Democrat city, recruiting enough Republican judges always becomes a challenge, just because there are many, many more Democrats than there are Republicans. So keeping that.
But as you've said previously, you don't need to be a card-carrying member of the Republican Party to be a Republican judge.
That's true, but that is true. So, but when you sign up to be a judge, you declare you're either Republican or Democrat, because by law, we have to have at least one Republican and one Democrat poll manager, at least one Republican and one Democrat election judge. We can have others, green, nonpartisan, whatever, in addition to, but not in place of. And so, to answer your question, do we have enough today? Well, we think we do. We maintain that database. We're in the process of notifying all of our poll workers. Here's the election coming up. Are you available? If not, then you keep going down the list. But it's always a challenge, especially for a large citywide election, to make sure that we have enough poll workers in place who are properly trained, who can do the job they're supposed to do on election day.
And you train them in mass, correct?
We do. Usually the training sessions have anywhere between 30 and 50 people. and we have as many training sessions as we have people. So we'll start those trainings, I believe, at the end of this month or early next month, and they'll go all the way through February, up and until the last day before the election.
Is there a particular training session for the March primary? I mean, there's only one thing on the ballot, is that correct?
Well, there's only one on the ballot, but we still train our poll workers with full training, because the hope is that we'll use those poll workers again for the April election, the August election, and the election. Well, those elections may have they will have more than one option to vote on a particular race.
True. How are they? I'm sorry.
I was going to say, and the process and the procedure is the same for every election in a sense. A poll worker needs to know when a voter comes in and comes up to your table. What do you do? You greet them, you ask for some form of identification, which does not have to be photo ID. And then if it's a primary, do you want a particular party ballot? If there's a nonpartisan ballot, is that available? Do you want paper ballot? Do you want touchscreen ballot? The process is the same. The only thing that differs a little bit is if it's not a major election, they won't be as busy, probably during the day. But we think in March and in August and November, I'm not so sure about April, they're going to be very busy from beginning to end.
So how are they dispersed? How do you know how many to have at a polling place, and when? Because at some point, I mean, you guys do, I think, a good job of sort of figuring out roughly how many people are going to vote in a given election, past history, but also the rhythm of voting. Some people vote early in the morning, get it over with. Some people vote on their lunch or during the course of the day because they've got a job that'll let them off. And then you have another group of folks who come in right at about 4:30, 5 o'clock when they get off work. How do you decide, determine where to put people?
Well, we look at a lot of past elections that are similar to the election we're looking at. So maybe not the one we had last year, but for this year, we'll look at 2016, 2018, the bigger years for elections. And then we'll look at the number of registered voters. And we usually use that number to kind of determine, do we need one set of election workers? Do we need two sets? Do we need more managers there? Do we need maybe some other just helpers at that polling place? And we try to make our best guess to get the most people there for kind of our most voter turnout scenario. So that we always have enough people there. But there's been instances in the past where we've had some lines, and we have procedures in place on the day of the election to address those things. We have extra workers that are called alternates that are just at our office that we could use to disperse out to polling locations if they become busy throughout the day. We can also have the capacity with the paper balloting to set up some more tables and chairs to allow more people to vote in the polling place at one time. So there's a couple different ways we approach that to try to get those flows throughout the day. But our poll workers also know, hey, we're going to be busy in the morning, we're going to be busy at lunch, and then we're going to be busy after 4:30. Because most of our poll workers are veterans. They've done this before, and they know those flows. So we certainly want to get voters in and out. I mean, our number one goal is when a citizen shows up, they get to vote. There might be a different process for them to do it depending on what kind of identification they bring, whether they're registered or not, but we want you to vote. So we try to put enough people on the site to make sure that can happen. That's the goal for every election.
So let me back up a little bit.
Sure.
A polling place is not controlled by the Board of Election Commissioners, correct?
On election day, it is. I mean, in the sense, we don't own any of our polling places, but any polling place that we use, we consider that our domain on election day. Now, not if it's a school, we don't interfere with anything going on in the school. We maintain that separation. But in terms of what physically occurs in the voting area, so starting 25 feet from the outer door, nobody can be electioneering, handing out literature, wearing paraphernalia within 25 feet of that outer door. And once they cross into the door and go into the polling place, the voting area, that's our jurisdiction. And so we have the right to keep people out who don't belong there. So voters are allowed to be in there if they have a small child with them. If they need an assistance and they bring someone with them, they can do that. But people can't just wander in, even elected officials, and say, gee, how's it going today? In a nice way, a polite way. Our folks are trained. If you're not here to vote, then you need to leave. You need to go outside. So in a sense, it's our domain, election day.
But I want to go to Steve's point about who's responsible for all the tables and chairs. Is that the Board of Election, or is that the entity that is hosting you for that day?
It depends on the entity. We'll work with an entity to figure out if they have tables and chairs or not. If they don't, or they don't have enough, we'll certainly contract to bring those tables and chairs in. It just depends on who we're working with. St. Louis Public Schools, we have about 44 polling locations. They do a pretty good job about providing tables and chairs, but we have to supplement them sometimes on Election Day. And some of the private businesses we use, the churches, the community centers, again, if they have tables and chairs, that's something we certainly check before every election and make arrangements to make sure we have enough voting locations for our voters.
I want to. I got a chance to read the report from September 2019. It's called "Will I Be Able to Cast My Ballot? Race, Income, and Voting Access on Election Day" by Gina Gunn and the Center for Social Development. And part of the conversation was about long lines, and I guess on one hand, I like the fact that there's a long line. It means people are interested, but is that overplayed because the number of people, you really don't know how many people are going to show up. You can only do your best guess. But all of a sudden, a van of 20 pulls up and jumps out to go vote. You're restricted to what you've already seen and done on the number of chairs, number of tables, etc. So part of me says, I'd rather see long lines, no lines. I'll say that. But is that just a function of that particular election and the fact that perhaps the number of election judges, your best guesstimate, was less than the number of people who sort of jumped into that polling place?
I mean, there's a couple different factors. The particular election she looked at, by the way, we invited her into, I think, 7 different city locations. I went out to a training and helped train her students to what to expect for election days, and it was a good partnership. I thought we learned a lot, and I think they learned a lot. But as far as lines go, we try to minimize them, but it is a guess. It's a best guess by us to figure out what we think is going to be a turnout. And then we're limited with space sometimes with parking situations and poll workers. But the thing we do, I think, that are proactive in that is we ask voters, especially on those large big ballots, go to our sample ballot. Get online with either our website or the League of Women Voters. You can pull up your particular address. You can see your ballot, and you could practice writing your ballot. It sounds a little juvenile to do that, but what happens is if you practice that ballot and you get to the polling location, the time that you spend when you actually vote is minimized, and that really helps keep down lines. If everybody shows up, they know who they want to vote for, they vote, they cast their ballot, the next person can vote. We've seen in the past with large ballots, some voters can take 20 minutes or so to fill out a ballot, and that really is going to slow down the line. So what we try to do is provide as many seating locations as we can secure, both paper ballot and touch screens, to allow that capacity in. But we also turn to our voters and say, be prepared when you show up, especially if there's those propositions on the ballot that are kind of lengthy sometimes. Make sure you're familiar with those before you show up so you know which way you want to vote. That really helps the process.
And those ballots are normally printed in a newspaper a week before the election or the week of the election?
We actually do a ballot in the newspaper 2 weeks before the election and then right before the election. And we always encourage voters to go on the website different elections. We know, for example, the last presidential election, we had like 75%, 78% voter turnout. So we can anticipate that again this year, maybe higher. We know from experience that municipal elections can have much lower voter turnout. So we can control that to some extent and anticipate. It really does facilitate if the voter does their homework in the sense of, number one, going to the right polling place. Number two, getting the right line if there's more than one precinct. If they moved since last time, they've making sure that their voter registration information is current, so they can fact to the right polling place, and being familiar with what's on the ballot, so that when they do get up to the machine, either the touch screen or do the paper, they don't really have to deliver it. They can just mark their ballot accordingly and then be on their way.
But can't bring, or they shouldn't bring that simple ballot in. They can do that.
Yeah. Not they can do that as well. I mean, in the sense that when someone comes up to the poll place, invariably there are people representing campaigns of one kind or another handing out literature. It's okay for the voter to accept that literature. It's okay for them to actually bring into the polling place with them. Now they can't, while standing in line, be waving it around and telling their neighbors, look who I'm voting for. But they can bring it with them if they have a sample ballot that they either pulled out of the newspaper or took off of our website. That's actually a good idea to mark that in advance and bring that with them, because that will make it easy for them to cast their ballot. We also remind our poll workers that as people come in, if they do in fact have literature, which is okay, if they happen to leave it around the voting machine or around the table, please police it, pick it up, put it in a container so that we keep the polling place neat.
So I want to go back to election judges. How are they dispersed throughout the community?
We try to give them the option of working in their jurisdiction. That's kind of the whole purpose of an election judge. Originally was someone who was from that area who could say, you live here, I recognize you. Now it's advanced quite a bit since then, but we try to keep people in their neighborhoods. Sometimes, on occasion, we may have to transfer someone, depending on crowds, to a different location, or just depending on need. Some of the areas in St. Louis have a lower amount of volunteers who want to work elections. We do have to transfer people on occasion, but we really try to keep people within a real reasonable amount of mileage of their own polling place, so they can see their neighbors, they can recognize their neighbors. And again, they don't vote with them; they've given the ballot, but we want that community atmosphere within the polling places as much as possible.
But you are able to transfer people as necessary during an election.
I mean, it would be very rare for us to transfer someone who's already placed at a polling location. Like I said earlier, we have some alternates at the election board that we keep there for the majority of the day in case we need to supplement a polling place. Someone gets sick, someone gets injured or whatever. We can send out an alternate to that polling location. Or if there's a need because of a large turnout that we weren't expecting, we can send out another team to that location as well. But as far as transferring within the same day, that would be a pretty rare thing for us to do because we have other systems in place to supplement other polling locations.
Okay. So, have any of the polling places from the previous election been relocated or closed and new ones open from what I guess would be November of 21 or November of 2019?
There have been some changes. Generally speaking, we try not to move polling places too often, primarily because voters get used to where they have been voting. The biggest push will come when we do redistricting in 2020, 2021, because after that takes place, then all the lines get redrawn. And although we try and keep most of those polling places, we may have to make a number of adjustments. Now, having said that, we're always dealing with the proposition that every facility, excuse me, wants to remain a polling place. And in the city of St. Louis, we use a number of public schools, and the public schools, depending upon their budget, they may close a school, they may temporarily close one for renovation, in which case then we have to make an adjustment. When we do that, we scour the neighborhood to see what's available. We try and touch base with the local elected officials to see if they have any particular contacts they'd like us to pursue. And then when we send out our election notice card, if there has been a change in a polling place, we highlight that on the card so that hopefully the voter not only will see there's an election coming up, but, oh, they're telling me in red ink or whatever, I no longer vote here, I vote over here. And then we post signs at the old polling place that the polling location has shifted from point A to point B.
And in doing that, you have to do all the normal things. So, is there parking? Is it accessible ADA guidelines, et cetera? So you go through a process, I would assume, when you are looking at a new facility. How ready is this to meet all of federal, state, and local guidelines?
That's exactly right. We have checklists that we go through. We send teams out to take video, to take photographs. We also have contracts with all of the private facilities to make sure what we think is going to be there and accessible is there on election day. So we have a pretty thorough process currently to look and examine at any potential polling place. We also view our polling places we've been using for years with the same standards to make sure that we have, again, every voter who shows up, regardless of a disability or not, can vote, and vote in a pretty similar fashion to any other regular voter.
When I was putting this on Facebook, I got the usual question about somebody with a disability being able to vote. Can one of you walk through how persons who have a disability, what steps do you all go through to make sure that they're able to vote?
Absolutely. There's numerous. And first of all, we try to have the path of whatever kind of voter who shows up with a disability or not be the same. But in some instances where that's not possible, we add things to polling places. We may add ramps, cones, any kind of assistance that we think would be necessary to get that path to be the same. If that's not possible, which we're hoping to avoid, we want all of our polling places to be accessible. We have the alternatives. We have curbside voting at every polling location.
And what is curbside voting?
Curbside voting is someone who pulls up in a car or walks up on the street can call a number or ring a bell from outside the polling location, which will alert our poll workers inside to bring a ballot out to that voter. They'll do the same process they do inside, but outside. So they'll still verify the voter in some fashion, and they'll provide the right ballot, and the ballot will be in a privacy envelope. The voter will vote, and then that bipartisan team will take.
This has got to be both a Republican and a Democrat that go out to the curb to do curbside voting.
Correct.
Yeah.
They will then take that ballot back inside and put it in the ballot box similarly to if the voter had voted themselves inside the location. We also have a great program in the state of Missouri called the Permanently Disabled List. If you have a voter who knows they can't get to a polling location because of a disability, if they notify of that in advance, we will mail them an application for an absentee ballot, and they can vote absentee for every election that they're on the list for.
So they'll automatically get a ballot.
Well, they won't get the ballot; they'll get the application.
The application.
Right. We run into problems in primaries because there's lots of different ballots. So we have to just send the application, and then when we get the application back, we will process it and send that ballot to whatever mailing address the voter wants it at. And then there's some timelines they deal with that, but everything's paid for postage-wise. They just mail it back to us. So again, we just really try to get anybody who wants to vote the ability to vote, whether that's inside the polling place, whether that's through curbside voting, or some type of absentee process to assist that voter.
What is the thank you for that. That has been a concern. First of all, what's the expectations of being an election judge? What kind of kind of people. Those terrible. What are you looking for in an election, Judge?
Well, legally, someone who's going to be an election judge has to be able to read, write, understand the English language. They have to attend, and they have to be a registered voter. They don't necessarily have to live in that particular jurisdiction, but a practical matter, the overwhelming number of poll workers do, in part because it makes it easier for them to get to the polling place, and in part because recruiting poll workers from another jurisdiction is a bit of a challenge. So, for example, in the city of St. Louis, where we historically have a more difficult time recruiting Republicans, we would legally be able to use Republicans from St. Louis County or Jefferson County, whatever, but those jurisdictions typically need those workers themselves, and so that becomes a bit of a challenge. And then training them to do the kind of job they need to do on election day. Now, one of the challenges we all face as election officials is our poll worker base is primarily senior citizens. I happen to be a senior citizen, so I have no quarrel with that. But many of them are folks who perhaps have been doing it for a long time and have become comfortable doing their way, as opposed to necessarily doing it the way we train them to do. So that becomes a challenge. From time to time, we always reach out, especially during the major elections, for example, to the colleges and the universities. And typically in a presidential year, there's a lot more increased activity interest. And so, but then you run into students who are interested, but gee, I got classes between these hours, I can't work the whole day. And it's very, very difficult to split up an assignment between two or more poll workers, unless there's some real assurance that in fact they will fulfill their allotted time slots. And that becomes a real challenge to do that. So recruiting people who are interested, who are willing to commit to a 2+ hour training session, and then who are willing to commit to a very, very long day.
Very long day. Right?
Polls open at 6, but workers have to be there by 5, which means they probably have to get up at 4 o'clock to be somewhere by 5 o'clock to start setting up, to open up the polls at 6. Polls close at 7, but that doesn't mean they're done, because if anyone's in line, they still get to vote. And then all the
not in the door, but in the line.
In the line. So even if the line is out the door, poll workers are trained to know that somebody then has to go up and stand at the end of the line, wherever it is, with a sign if necessary, so that anyone who might come up after that knows that they're too late. So it gets to be an incredibly long day. We understand because it's longer for us. Poll workers don't get paid a tremendous amount of money. That's a challenge. But our budget is what it is. And the most folks all the folks who work understand. These are the requirements. These are the hours. This is the pay. And most of them do it out of a sense, I think, of dedication. But it still becomes a challenge to make sure that everyone, number one, we have the right number of poll workers. Number two, that they're all properly trained, even if you've done it for a long, long time. Rules change. For example, the voter ID. Once upon a time, you didn't need a photo ID. Several years ago, the legislature passed a law that said you have to have a photo ID, but if you don't, you can do this and this. That was challenged, and the Supreme Court has now said you can't do that because it's all confusing. So there is no photo ID requirement. So things like that change. We have to review with the poll workers and make sure they're all comfortable with what the requirements are, and that they're with an experienced person, because we like to get fresh blood and new faces, but we don't want to throw them out there without, number one, having training, but also working with a veteran.
So let's go into the Missouri Supreme Court ruling around voter ID. What did it say, and what does that mean for the average voter now?
Well, it means what we've been doing for the last 2 years, we're going to continue to do. I mean, that's the easiest exclamation for a voter. Again, just show up. If you have an ID with you, great. We'll process you through. If you don't, we have processes for that as well. What the court case was all about was signing an affidavit if you didn't have what the legislature deemed the appropriate type of ID. And what the Supreme Court has now said is that affidavit, for a whole bunch of reasons, was just inadequate. So we're left with, if you show up with either a photo ID or some kind of identification, college ID, or even a utility bill, or even better, the election notice card that we send out, we'll process you through.
Passport would be another one.
Passport would work. Any kind of governmental ID would work. Military ID would work. And then if you don't have any kind of identification, there is a provisional ballot process that we can get you through, so you can still get that ballot cast. And then there's some steps we take to ensure that those provisional voters are registered voters. So again, there might be a different path for each voter who walks in the polling place, but we want to get each person that ballot and give them that opportunity to exercise their right to vote.
So I can come in without an ID with a picture on it. Because I hope my utility bill doesn't have my picture. But I can come in even with that, as long as it sort of shows who I am. One, my name, LOU, two, my address.
I mean, also procedures. If you're going to sign a vote, we'll pull you up in what we call the poll pad, the iPad. And there'll be a signature line there, the signature line, and you the signature we have on record. So there's little things you do internally to verify sure that those persons who show up are who they say they are. But if you need to know show some kind of identification, co-identification, and we'll get you the line. But it certainly makes the process faster if you bring a photo ID, especially a Missouri driver's license or that election notice card that's a non-photo ID. The whole reason I bring that up is it has that barcode on it, and we have a process set up at the polling places for those poll pads to read that barcode to again get a quicker time through the line to make sure we keep the line short. So it's not a requirement or necessity, but it certainly makes I think everyone's experience at the polling place is a little bit quicker and more pleasurable on the election day.
Yeah. There are really three scenarios, if you will. So who shows up with identification does not have to be photo. With identification, that's acceptable under the statute. And they're in the poll pad, they get to vote, no questions asked. If the voter shows up and they have no identification at all, you're out for a walk or a dog, and it looks like the line is not very long, so they're going to vote, which is a possibility. But they're in the poll pad. We show them as being a registered voter. They have no ID. They still get to vote, but they vote a provisional ballot, which is exactly the same as the regular ballot, but it means that when that comes down to the election office at the end of the day, we have to do some verification. The third possibility is someone shows up, whether they have identification or not, and they're not in the poll pad. And we check downtown, and we say we have no record of Gary Stuff being a registered voter. And that would insist they're registered and they want to vote. Same as the other provisional ballot, just goes into a different envelope, because the different envelope tells us we don't think this voter is registered. They think they are. We have to turn out that we do our homework. This is not an election. It's next release. That voters we know it's not registered. We never open the envelope. We never count the ballot. If they are registered, we open up the envelope. We count the ballot. And if it turns out we don't show them as being registered, we don't count the ballot. We use the information to them, register them for the next election. So I think the important message for every registered voter to know is go to your polling place and vote. Even if you don't have ID, you'll still get to vote. And you do not need a photo ID under any circumstance.
Finally. Good night. We only have a couple minutes left. I want to talk about one particular issue, and that is provisions for ex-felons to be able to vote. How does that occur in the state of Missouri?
So we have a dedicated employee who checks, who's in contact with the courts, Missouri courts, to verify if someone's on probation or parole. And what she'll do is she'll get a list, and when she gets a list of people taken off probation or off parole, she will automatically, without that person even knowing, reinstate their voting privileges in the state of Missouri. So there's a process in place for that to occur. Now, what the current state of the law is, if you're on probation or parole, you cannot vote. You lose that ability to vote. That's different than a lot of states, but in Missouri, that's the current law.
So if you are out of prison, you're not off probation or parole, you're still on it, that means you can't vote.
You cannot vote. You can be registered in our system. You will be an inactive voter until we've received notification you've completed that probation or parole. So there is an automatic process to reinstate that person, but while you're serving that probation time or that parole time, you're an ineligible voter in the state of Missouri.
And so after I am off probation or parole, there's an automatic reinstatement based on my previous address.
That's correct. You would be re-registered or reactivated under whatever address we had. And just like any other voter, if you had moved in that time, you would need to notify us of that move via any of the things we went over earlier. Or if you just want to verify that that is occurring, if you're on probation and parole, you can call our office, and we can let you know. You might have to come down to show some kind of identification, but we can let you know if that process has been completed or not for the election.
I'm wondering how many organizations that serve ex-felons know that there's an automatic reinstatement once you leave probation and parole, because it seems to me that A, they should be touting that, and B, they should be following up, coming down to the office. Ignore Tucker, that was a shameless plug. Where checking on their address.
Right, and we've done some on our part to try to make sure that happens. Over the last couple of years, I've visited the jails on numerous occasions to try to register inmates, regardless if they're on probation or parole or not, because they'll be eligible when they're released. And then inform them. I was very surprised at the number of them who thought they could never vote again because they had some kind of prior criminal history. So it was,
which is possibly because they've listened to what goes on in other states.
Maybe.
I mean, and Florida is having all kinds of madness, and won't go down that road. But if I'm hearing that from other states, then I'm likely to think it also applies here, when in fact it doesn't.
Right. I think a lot of people do believe that. So that's a time for we can maybe use a little bit more of our educational aspect of the Board of Elections to let people know that. And that's why we've been visiting jails. We had a partnership with one of the, I forget her title, I'm sorry, but down at the Department of Christian City, where she would have her social workers let them know so they could transfer that education to the inmates to let them know, hey, this is one of the options you have when you get released, depending on your situation. So make sure you check with the Board of Elections to make sure they have current address and get you reactivated with your registration.
It's important to know that the individual, the voter, the convicted felon who is now served time and satisfied probation should be receiving from the Department of Corrections some official piece of paper that confirms that they are now off paper. So that's how we know if they come to our office and bring that verification, that's how we know to reinstate them. We don't have any automatic mechanism where we get notified that someone has satisfied their time.
So you don't get, and I wouldn't expect you to, but
no.
Just to ask the question, you don't get a list from Department of Corrections that said the following people are off probation and parole, et cetera.
No, we get notified of convicted felons, but we do not get notified of felons who are now off paper and eligible to be reinstated to vote.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So a question I forgot to ask, is going through my notes, is I've gotten several questions about police officers being in polling places. We've talked about this before, but because I'm old, I don't remember what the conversation was, so we'll go back over it again. Police being at, just walking into polling places, what is that?
Well, that doesn't happen there's no reason for a police officer just to walk into a polling place. The only time we have police officers in the polling place. So for every ward, and there are 28, we have what's called a roving deputy team, one Republican and one Democrat. And they travel either in a police car or in a sheriff's deputy car. And they go from polling place to polling place just to make sure things are functioning properly or if there's some issue they need to address. It is typically common for the police officer or the sheriff's deputy to walk in with that bipartisan team just to be a presence. They have no reason to do anything other than walk in the door and stand off to the side while the roving deputies do what they do, checking with the judges, checking with the poll manager, everything going well, are you running shot on ballots, whatever. When they're done, there's no reason for anyone to linger. Now, early in the day, we do ask our roving deputies, once you've visited all the polling places, as you revisit, take a little time just to observe what's going on. Make sure the poll workers are doing what they're supposed to do. But when you're done, go on to the next one. Just keep going. And so the police officer typically will walk in with them, and then will walk out with them, get back in the police car, and go on to the next stop. The only exception to that would be if there is some particular incident or disturbance that has occurred that would require a police presence to address it, and that might even come not from us, but someone else who, I don't know, I saw someone get into a fist fight. We also maintain what we call special deputies at the election board office, which are like roving deputies, but they're stationed at our office so that if we need to send out a bipartisan team, and we'll do that in either a police car or a sheriff's deputy car. But generally speaking, there are not police stationed in a polling place.
I am glad you cleared that up, but I'm sure the next time you all are with me, we'll do that again. So real quick, we got about a minute left. I'll allow one more shameless plug at the end. So we start off on March 10th. Go through the list again of the elections that are
So
coming up in
March
City
10th is
St.
a
Louis.
presidential preference primary. April 7th is a special election. It'll be an MSD bond issue. August the 4th is the main primary election that covers all the offices from governor down to committee person. And then November the 3rd is the general presidential election. And then when you get past all that and get into spring of 2021, there's a March prime municipal election. I don't have the date of that. And there's a general municipal election in April. And then we go.
So you'll be busy for a while. Is that what I
We will
hear?
be, yes,
We
sir.
will be.
Well, gentlemen, thank you. You know, you're welcome at any time, and certainly after an election, you want to stop by and let me know how it goes and what took place. I'd love to have you. So thank you all for being here today.
You're welcome.
We are out.
Thank you.